Good evening. I'd like to call this special meeting of the Portland Board of Public Education to order. It is Tuesday, March 10th, 2020. The Portland Board of Public Education is meeting in Casco Bay High School in the great space. May I please ask Assistant Superintendent Malia Nally to call the roll?
Sure. Mr. Atkinson?
Here.
Mr. Balfons?
Here.
Ms. Bondo? I think she was here, but we'll come back. Mr. Burke?
Here.
Ms. Figdor?
Here.
Ms. Morioni?
Here.
Ms. Thompson?
Here.
Ms. Trevorrow?
Here.
Ms. Brown? Mr. Casiel Reyes?
Here.
Ms. Habibsai?
Here.
Mr. Parrott? Ms. Yangala?
I'm here.
And Chair Rodriguez.
Presente. And Mr. Parrott and Ms. Brown did tell me ahead of time that they wouldn't be joining us today, so that's why they're not with us. Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to hear the presentation from Superintendent Botana on his proposed FY21 budget and consider accepting and referring it to the Finance Committee for further review and consideration. Therefore, the only item of business will be new business. During the proceedings, the public will have an opportunity to address the board with comments related to the motion, which, like I said, would be referring the budget to the Finance Committee. At the end of the meeting, there'll be an open floor for any other general public comment not associated with tonight's agenda for those who wish to address the board. So having said that, new business, consideration and action to accept the superintendent. Yes, Ms.
Sorry, I just wanted, when you said there wasn't any public comment, can you tell the public when it is an opportunity for them to speak?
Regarding the budget, you mean?
Yes, please.
So that that will be part of the superintendent's presentation, and we will share the timeline and the dates of the public hearings. And I have myself a note to mention that certainly before the end of the night. So I'll let the superintendent get us there after his presentation. So new business, consideration and action to accept the superintendent's FY21 budget and refer it to the Finance Committee. Is there a motion? Ms. Trevorrow, second by Ms. Bondo. Will the superintendent please speak to the motion?
Yes, Mr. Rodriguez, and thank you, and good evening to members of the board. Before I begin, I would like to thank my team here at Portland Public Schools. I know you've heard me say this before, but I'm incredibly proud to lead a team of courageous and committed educators. This year's budget has required us to take stock of our work and understand that we must continue to move forward towards supporting the needs of our most vulnerable students if we're going to meet our goals. The budget that we will discuss today does that, but requires significant change in order to do so. The theme of the FY21 budget proposal is addressing the opportunity gap. It calls for putting our district's equity goal at the center of our work by making investments to reduce achievement and opportunity gaps for the district's economically disadvantaged students, students of color, and students who are English language learners. In our third year of the Portland Promise, this theme reflects a sense of urgency to realize the commitments embodied in that Portland Promise and a growing understanding of the sense of urgency to realize the commitments embodied in the Portland Promise and a growing understanding of the pathway to accomplishing it. Over the past 2 years, we've been able to make important strides. In 2019 and FY19, we established that students' access to challenging core content required strong, uniform supports, and we also strengthened our supports for our students' social emotional development and their ability to have a meaningful relationship with a caring adult. Last year, we expanded our commitment to supporting core content We committed the district to expanding access to pre-kindergarten over the next 4 years, and we created a behavioral health continuum across our elementary, middle, and most of our high schools. My proposal continues to make progress towards our equity goal and also respects the guidance that was provided by the City Council to keep our tax increase to 3% over the current tax rate. Now I'm going to turn this over to our Executive Director of Budget and Finance, Miranda Fasulo, to walk you through the proposed budget that reflects these two goals. And when she's done outlining the overall financial picture, I will return to walk us through our proposed investments and the pathway for making them. So Miranda?
So thank you, Superintendent, and good evening, everyone. So I'm just going to start off by walking us through really a high-level summary of the financials included in the Superintendent's FY21 proposed budget. And so you guys all have in your packets and also posted online our budget booklet. And so as, over this evening and moving through the budget process, as you have time to scrutinize everything line by line, I'm more than happy to take questions on those details either this Thursday at our Finance Committee meeting or at the many additional meetings that we have as we proceed through the budget process. So with that, I'll begin by just highlighting a few key figures. So our FY21 proposed budget is $122.3 million. That represents a 4.2% increase over FY20, as well as a 3% increase in the school tax rate. And now at the bottom of your screen, you can see how those figures compare with what we proposed last year. So by last year, I'm referring to our FY20 budget, so our current year budget, but the budget that we proposed last year, which was $117.4 million. At that time, it represented a 6.2% increase over the prior year budget and a 4.9% increase over the school tax rate. So here we just have a summary really of the precise dollar figures included in the budget. You can see that the actual precise figure of the budget is $265,915. And of course, as we do every year, we're proposing a balanced budget. So both our revenue and our expenses have gone up by about 4.2%, and that represents about a $4.9 million increase over FY20. So in terms of the taxpayer impact of this budget, you can see that the property tax levy, so that's the amount of money that we're proposing to raise through taxes, has actually gone up by 4.1%, but that only actually requires an increase to the tax rate of 3%. And the reason for that is that $85 million figure that you're seeing there when the property tax valuation, so that's new valuation expected in the city of Portland for the upcoming year, and that $85 million right off the bat increases our revenue by $1 million without any increase in the tax rate at all. And then thereafter, each percentage point on the tax rate yields another $950,000 or so in tax revenue. And in terms of household and individual taxpayer impact, the proposed tax rate increase of 35 cents brings the school tax rate to $12.04. And for folks in the city of Portland who own a home valued at about $250,000, that means about an $88 a year increase in annual property taxes. So as you can see from this figure, property taxes obviously are far and away our largest revenue source, about 80% of our revenue. And then in addition to property taxes, we also have a sizable chunk, about 15%, that we receive from the state in the form of EPS subsidy, and about 5% of our revenue comes from all other sources. So this slide presents just a little bit more detail on those other sources of revenue. So we were very fortunate this year to actually receive an increase in our state EPS subsidy of approximately $750,000 over the EPS budget for last year. And I also do want to point out that we are expecting to receive an additional $235,000 in state subsidy for FY21 as a result of an accounting adjustment related to seed that I won't bore you with the details of, but it's going to be favorable for us, and I've been assured by the state that we should expect to receive it in FY21. Worst case scenario, we receive it in FY22, but we will. I'm currently actually, because of the expectation of receiving the revenue and the state assuring me of that, I'm actually reflecting it in fund balance until it's formally reflected in our ED 279, so I can't reflect it as state subsidy until we kind of officially get it in that paperwork in that official report. But so I do want to point out down there in the use of fund balance, what appears to be a large increase in our fund balance, $235,000 of that is just a holding account for that increase in subsidy that we're expecting. About $60,000 or so is a true increase in the use of fund balance, and that's specifically for food services to make a one-time purchase of equipment in FY21. And so other sources of revenue that are in these other categories that we don't talk about as much because it's only 5%, but I still want to mention. In federal revenue, we're talking specifically about our food services reimbursement, federal reimbursement revenue, and we're talking about our Medicaid reimbursement, our Maine Care revenue. This is just our local budget, so this does not include any grant revenue. So the figure that you're seeing up here is not inclusive of any grants, any title grants, or IDEA grant, or anything like that. It's just Maine Care and food services primarily. Under local non-tax revenue, we get tuition. We also have paid meals, and that tuition includes adult ed tuition. And in other state revenue sources, we receive our adult ed subsidy, which is about $600,000, and that was actually up $100,000 this year, so that was good news. And we also receive reimbursements from the state for students who are state agency clients. So moving on to the expenditure side of the budget. Some of you may have seen this before. No surprise to anyone, our FY21 expenditure budget is by and large comprised of salaries and benefits, about 80% of our budget. And then contracted services, debt services, and supplies and other miscellaneous costs each account for about 7%. And of that big 80% salary and benefits square that you saw on the last slide, about half of that is teacher salaries. Another quarter is district-wide benefits, so that's for all staff. About 18% is administrative and support staff. And then ed tech salaries and other temp salaries round out the remaining 11% of the budget. And so here are really the specifics behind our expenditure budget. So you can see that our salaries and benefits, that costs that we're proposing for FY21 are up about 3.6%, representing a $3.3 million increase. And the largest expense driver, at least percentage-wise, is 8%, an 8% increase in benefits costs. And down in non-salary, we're looking at approximately a 6.4% increase. And that represents about $1.6 million. And you can see utilities are up about 13% there, but I do want to point out that if you look at the FY19 actuals column, the utilities costs are actually only up about 3% over our FY19 actuals, so you can see why it is that we are making a fairly sizable proposed adjustment there. So finally, I'd just like to call out a few of the other key non-salary expense drivers that were included in that $1.6 million we were just looking at. So our debt service is up about $465,000. So that is actually far less than we were projecting earlier in the fall, and that's a result of the timing of our LICEF bond issuance. So we were able to kind of dial back our expected increase there, which was great. Utilities I already discussed. And for pre-K, we had some non-salary items that needed to be built in this year, as we learned from last year's expansion and associated costs there. We have metro fares going up for our students who ride the bus. Our crossing guards rates are going up as well. Recycling is up just all over the world, as we all know. It's going up about $80,000. That's a very substantial percentage. I think it's like triple what we paid this year. Our property and liability insurance rates have increased substantially. And finally, that $200,000 there, again, related to seed accounting, which is really fun, as a lot of specific instructions that come from the state on that. So just making another adjustment there. That $200,000 is actually not an increase to our budget per se. It's kind of a phantom increase. It's just an accounting adjustment. So it's beneficial to us for our state subsidy to account for a certain portion of our seed as an expense as opposed to a revenue reduction, which is how we've done it in the past. And so this $200,000 increase is actually completely offset by a $200,000 increase in our revenue. So there's no impact here to our budget gap or to our tax rate or anything like that. It's actually just a net neutral expense that you will see as an expense line, but it's not anything to concern ourselves with. And finally, about $215,000 is representative of an increase related to new investments. And so with that, that's my segue to turn it back to the superintendent to talk about what those new investments are, as well as all of the other new investments that we are proposing in our FY21 budget. So, thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. So the Portland Promise guides our work. I'm consistently grateful for and inspired by this board's unwavering support for our goals, and I'm particularly grateful for your commitment to our equity goal. Time and again, you've reaffirmed your commitment to this goal in both your policy work and in the allocation of resources. And clearly, it's necessary. The gap between our economically disadvantaged students and their non-disadvantaged peers is simply unacceptable. The same is true for students of color when compared to white students. And while these slides feature test performance, the same is true when you look at discipline disparities, when you look at participation in more challenging curricula, referrals for special education, and most every other measure. Over the past few months, we've outlined for you the key investments that we believe would position us to continue to close the opportunity gap. Altogether, we've identified almost $4 million in investments that are closely associated with our continued pre-K expansion, strengthening core instruction and supports for students with disability and those who are second language learners. However, I recognize that this level of investment exceeds our capacity to raise the necessary revenue. Thus, as we did last year with our pre-K and behavioral health continuum, I believe that we have the data and processes in place to phase these investments in over the coming years. As you will see, what we're proposing here is an incremental approach to getting us there. I would like to walk you through our process for getting at our current proposed investments. In the process, I will bring you back to the overall needs in each of the key areas of investment and highlight what we're proposing for this year's investment. In the process, you will also see all that we're not able to advance this year. Let's start with pre-kindergarten. Our multi-year budget already envisioned an additional 2 pre-K classrooms, so that's in our baseline. And additionally, we committed to reducing the barriers to access, and this includes providing transportation and before and after care for students. It also requires that we build in the support for students who are learning English and have other special needs, and of course, it means that we have to properly outfit those classrooms. My budget proposal includes the classroom expansion, the outfitting of the classrooms, and scaling up of our staffing and transportation to allow us to remove this barrier. We are looking for alternative means for meeting the language needs of our pre-K students, and we'll have a plan for doing that in the future. We also will not be able to provide district-funded before and after care programming this coming year, but will continue to work with Starting Strong to support families in finding available before and after care options to the extent that they're available. The second focus area for our work is to sustain and deepen our core content work. Our theory of action here is ensuring that we give more and more of our students access to grade-level content. This work, as many of you know, has been phased in over the past 3 years, and we're facing a significant challenge in that in addition to taking the next steps in our core content implementation, we're facing a reduction in federal title funding and the rising costs for the staff that are currently funded through the federal funds. So while our scale-up is included in my proposal, we will need to do additional work over the course of the spring and into next year to ensure that we're able to preserve our coaching supports as we navigate the gap of $650,000 in federal funding. The third area is investing in removing barriers, particularly for students who are English learners and those who have other special needs. Let's begin with the students who are English language learners. You recall our workshop just last week where we discussed in detail the costs associated with implementing our LAU plan. This is critically important as the achievement gap for our English language learners is the largest gap that we face. And it's one that's very near and dear to my heart. In addition to having been such a student and being a teacher of those students, when I started my tenure here, I was finishing my service as the only practitioner of the National Academies for Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's consensus study on how best to meet the needs of students and youth who are English learners. That study, entitled Promising Futures, outlines the context and practices associated with meeting the needs of this population. Our LAU plan is consistent with this research and is our legal and moral obligation. As you recall, the LAU plan calls for increasing collaboration between our mainstream and EL teachers by providing appropriate staffing level to allow for students to have their intensive English language development needs met and have sufficient resources to collaborate and push into mainstream classes. It also calls for developing students' heritage language, developing programming for students with limited and interrupted formal schooling, serving students who are dual identified as English learner and students with disabilities, and fostering dual credentialing, beginning with our school-based coaches and eventually reaching more and more of our mainstream content teachers. My budget proposes to add the appropriate staffing, almost 7 teachers, to allow us to do that first component, collaboration and IELD in our K-12 classrooms. We will continue to evaluate ways in which we might be able to advance other aspects with existing resources or by phasing them in over time. The final area for removing barriers is the area of special education. This, again, is an area with significant achievement gaps. But additionally, it's an area where the law is pretty clear about our legal and moral obligations to meet certain staffing levels. Again, you saw much of this last week, so it should be fairly fresh in your mind. We've identified key areas such as finishing the behavioral health continuum that we started last year by adding the social work and ed tech resources to Deering High School, creating a continuum for students who are on the autism spectrum, and right-sizing our staffing ratios in our functional life skills high school program, our occupational therapists and psychologists, as well as adding a release teacher to assist schools with their case studies and IEP meetings. My proposed budget includes funding the continuum of for students in the autism spectrum, as well as some justified case manager staffing and a half-time occupational therapist and a half-time school psychologist. Our special education has identified some needs that cannot be put off beyond this, and we'll be working on reorganizing resources to meet those needs to the minimum extent required by law. Finally, for the investment portion of my presentation, I do want to point out that my budget asks for a $50,000 investment to contract for a new web page. Our website is increasingly the face of the organization, and frankly, it needs a makeover. Also, we're responding to the needs identified by our adult education to begin to transition some of our hourly staff to full-time staff. The increase you see here is less than a full FTE because the rest is offset with reductions in the hourly employees that would be replaced. So how would we accomplish that? I want to start by reminding you that our baseline budget exceeds what we're able to do with a 3% increase in the tax rate by about $450,000. And the investments that I've shared with you just now total about $1.4 million. So structurally, we need to reduce our budget about $1.85 million to include the investments and meet our budget target. Before I get into the specifics, I want to have us recall a couple of things. First, back in the summer, we agreed to form a work group made up of board and staff to review all of the possible options that had surfaced during the past 3 years. The work group did that and reviewed those options with the Finance Committee over the fall. For those of you on the Finance Committee this fall, I also want you to recall this slide. It was the basis for a prioritization activity that we engaged in to determine where to focus our energy as we looked at the needs before us and prioritize both our investments and our reductions. The graph depicts a continuum of equity focus versus steady state on one axis, and new, which is broadly defined as post-Portland promise, to legacy on the other axis. I still have the dot prioritization chart in my office, and I've returned to it and referred to it often as we prepared for this budget. So with that in mind, as we look to achieve the $1.85 million in reductions, we approached it in two different ways. First, we looked at areas where we could make adjustments. You can see those reductions here on this slide. First, I'm proposing to reduce 3 high school teaching positions, 2 at Deering High School and 1 at Portland High. Our incoming freshman class is significantly smaller than this year's class, so we believe that this reduction will minimize the impact of program offerings at either school. We've been working this year to come up with a data-driven staffing approach, similar to what you've seen us do with our EL and special ed staffing, and I expect that we'll be able to implement that fully next year, and that based on applying that approach, we may be able to make further staffing reductions in the future. We're proposing a series of reductions, including in the board's contingency and my department's contractual budget and an adjustment of COLA expectations. We are also making some staffing adjustments to our custodial staff, including reducing one of several vacant custodial positions. I'm also proposing an across-the-board 3% reduction in all of our supply budget. As you'll see, our supply budget is still higher than it was last year, so this is really a reduction from department proposals. And finally, I'm proposing to make a 2% reduction in the high school athletics and co-curricular budget. Additionally, I'm proposing 2 programmatic reductions. First, I'm proposing to end our elementary Spanish classes. Given the multilingualism in our community, we have a deep value for supporting language learning, and we're invested in increasing the number of students who ultimately achieve the seal of biliteracy. We remain committed to increasing the number of students who become proficient in multiple languages and intend to retain world language classes in middle school, high school, and with the elementary immersion program. I am, however, proposing that we eliminate our Spanish classes in 4th and 5th grade as a way to invest in our equity priorities, most notably in this context around better supports for students who are English language learners. I clearly see a value for our 4th and 5th graders getting some exposure to Spanish, but ultimately believe this is more of a nice to have than a must-have investment given our context and conviction around prioritizing equity. The second one is more challenging because it represents a very significant change in the way that we're organized as a district. That's the reconfiguration of our elementary schools into paired pre-K2 and 3-5 couplings. This reconfiguration is based on a proposal that emerged in the 2019 Enrollment and Facilities Study. The school pairings and levels proposed are Rowe for primary and Longfellow for intermediate, Lysith for primary and Talbot for intermediate, Ocean for primary and Presumpscot for intermediate, and Reiki for primary and East End for intermediate. In order to maximize the value of this reconfiguration, it is coupled with a proposal to increase the staffing ratios in grades 1, 2, and 3 from 22 students to a maximum of 25, which is consistent with the existing grades 4 and 5 staffing ratios. This reconfiguration serves both educational and financial purposes. Those purposes dovetail with our 3 investment areas of advancing our pre-kindergarten efforts and strengthening core instruction and reducing barriers to success for our students with the highest level of need. Educationally, there are advantages to organizing our elementary schools in tighter developmental grade level bands. Staff in these schools will be able to focus their recruitment and professional development efforts on primary or intermediate grades. This has the potential to increase staff levels of specialization. It also holds for special education and EL staffing, both in terms of specialization and in maximizing our resources. Larger grade level teams in these schools will allow for more depth of expertise among the team and additional options for mentoring. It allows for more student placement options with specific teachers and with peers, and the resulting student demographics are more closely representative of the school district. Financially, the reconfiguration is projected to save 20 teaching positions. These savings are accomplished by having more sections of each grade in our schools. It allows for more optional staffing of classrooms by maximizing the number of students in each section. Additionally, by reducing the number of sections needed across the district, it makes room to add pre-kindergarten classes in Portland Public School classrooms in addition to off-site partner locations. This would result in reduced partnership costs. And finally, federal title resources would be more evenly distributed across our schools, which would allow more flexibility as we strive to offset the reductions in federal funding and the increased costs of staffing funded through these grants. There are offsets to the reconfiguration savings, which are baked into the total projected savings. We estimate that we would lose the Community Eligibility Program, CEP, at Talbot and Presumpscot Elementary School. We would need to reapply for CEP for Reiki and East End Elementary Schools, and this would result in a projected loss of National School Lunch Program funding estimated at about $300,000. There will be a significant increase in the number of students that would be transported daily and an increase in the number of miles district buses would travel daily. The maximum bus ride duration will also increase, but there is no added cost for transportation as long as we're able to implement our pre-kindergarten transportation proposal. Over the next few weeks, I'll be asking you to make decisions to advance our common goals that would challenge our relationships and commitments. And I recognize that these are not easy decisions. There's a story that I want to close with. when President Obama and his first Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, began working together. They quickly came to understand that any policy decision requires difficult choices. Over time, they developed a shorthand that they used whenever they confronted those choices. One would look at the other and say, white T-shirt, and the other would say, medium. This reminded them that at some point they had a shared retirement fantasy, where neither one would be required to make tough decisions as they hoped to retire to Honolulu and open a T-shirt shop on Waikiki Beach where they would sell only medium white T-shirts. As I stand here before you today, I feel the incredible responsibility of asserting some hard choices. Clearly, this proposal is not about medium white T-shirts. It's about making critical choices in service of our equity goal. And it will be challenging, but I look forward to our dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent, for the presentation. If there's any questions on the motion, I'll remind the board, the motion on the floor is to accept and recommend, or rather refer the budget to the Finance Committee. So what I suggest we offer as questions is clarifying points, asking for additional information and such. And maybe the superintendent and Miranda can address them that way. So having said that, are there any questions on the motion? Let's go Ms. Morioni and then Ms. Victor.
Thank you, Chair Rodriguez. My question actually is more for Miranda on the revenue budget portion. You mentioned use of fund balance, and you talked a little bit about food service equipment. Can you explain that? I didn't hear of any equipment that we've allocated or approved.
They have proposed to purchase, I can't remember exactly what piece of equipment it is. Do you remember?
I think it's a walk-in freezer.
Okay. And so because it's a one-time kind of lump sum cost, I think it's about $60,000, we had thought it was a good use of their fund balance because it's not going to be a recurring cost where this fund balance will need to be budgeted and spent again in future years.
So the use of fund balance number is $296,199. So I guess under some of, in that chart, it would be great to have some more breakdown as to what those, because you talked about them pretty thoroughly, but it would just be nice to have more of a, so I'd like to request that, please.
I can also just kind of address that right now. So
Sure.
the $235,000 on top of the $60,000 for food services is just me placing the $235,000 of expected increase in EPS there until it's officially published in our ED 279. So that is exactly what that figure is. It's $60,000 for food services and $235,000 in anticipated EPS revenue that we expect to bump up and move to that revenue line when we get the official notice from the state on that.
Thank you. Also under, I was a little surprised by the benefits under the other chart around the expenditure budget with salaries and benefits, the 8% increase. And I just was curious as to, I thought we had a cap on the insurance coverage and things like that. So I'm just like some more specifics. It doesn't
So
have-
the teacher rate will be up 6%. We don't know the rate yet for other staff. It's been up as high as 9% in the last few years. Additionally, those rates are obviously much higher than our COLA, so it always kind of looks a little bit higher percentage-wise. Additionally, we have turnover savings in our staffing, retirements, et cetera, each year. We don't get any break on benefits when we have turnover in that way. We add FTEs and we add costs, and it doesn't matter how much people get paid, they still have the same, $15,000, $20,000 worth of health coverage that we pay for each FTE. The range that we pay on any staff member goes from 10 to 22,000 or so, depending on their elections. And so we also have to build in, some contingency there for open enrollment. There was an open enrollment since our last budget, and so, some of the change may have come from elections. So, it's based on my personnel model. That's the figure that we landed at. I agree. It looked striking to me as well. So, good question. Hopefully that I can offer more details if that's not fully satisfactory.
And then I have another question around the, let's see, actually, Tom's not, I'll hold that question. The other one around salary and benefits was, you had mentioned, well, do we have any figures yet on retirement numbers?
I believe there were 17 retirements built into the budget, and they accounted for approximately $600,000 worth of savings.
And that's
That's built in.
built in already?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think I had one more question. It was mentioned to us in the past, and this is actually for the superintendent, under the pre-K expansion. We had a community member ask about, have we looked at the data around those students that had started pre-K and their third grade testing? And I'm just curious if we had or have anything.
We have not yet, but we've noted that, and we'll be doing that.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Victor?
Thank you. I want to commend Miranda and the other staff for this presentation and the clarity of the information that's provided. It's incredibly easy to digest, and I greatly appreciate that. And I recognize the amount of work that took, so thank you so much. I had a couple of questions regarding I had a couple of questions first about the loss of title funds, and whether there would be a loss of school-wide title funds in the reconfiguration.
There would not.
And can you explain that a little bit?
Do you want to explain it, Malia? You want me to explain it? So none of our schools, the school-wide threshold is no school that is currently over it goes under it as a result of this. So we don't lose any school-wide. We actually will have different distribution if we move forward with reconfiguration. And so I do mention in the presentation that it will look like a redistribution. The money will be spread out more over the schools. And so that's what I was referring to. We are losing some title funding this year. We also have less available in carryover than we've had in the past because we've been chipping away at that. And, as I mentioned, it's not just what we're losing, but it's also the fact that our costs associated with those grants, so the people that we're paying for in those grants, their salaries, their benefits are continuing to increase. And so that's eating away at our capacity to do everything that we're currently doing with those grants. And that's how we arrive at the $650,000 gap. It's partly lost funding and partly additional costs.
Okay, thank you. And then in the reconfiguration section, you talk about this significant increase in the number of students that would be transported daily, and an increase in the maximum duration of bus rides. Can you talk about what those numbers are, both?
I don't know them off the top of my head, but we'll be prepared to talk about them with the Finance Committee as
Okay.
we go in depth into the reconfiguration.
Okay. And then on pre-K, I know that you're not including before and after care. I was surprised to see the scale of the cost estimate for providing before and after care. When we passed the expanded pre-K program, I believe that we, at that point, believed that it would be revenue neutral.
And then reality hits. So,
Yeah.
Malia, do you want to talk about that? Or?
I think part of the assumption that was built in at that time was related to the percent of families that would be paying on a sliding scale. So since that time, we've done surveying of families to understand interest and to try to gauge what's likely going to happen. And what we learned is that the majority of the families that were expressing interest would not be paying on the sliding scale. So we are wanting to model it with an assumption that a large percent of families wouldn't be paying, so that we didn't get ourselves into a situation where we are assuming more revenue than would come in.
Thank you. And then on the reconfiguration, so your proposal is to increase class size limits from 22 students to 25 students for grades 1, 2, and 3. Have you considered how those increases in class size would offset benefits that we are able to achieve by providing more support for our EL students and special education investments and so forth? So how the investments that we make in this budget to address equity could be offset by increases in class size.
And we will be talking more about that when we get into the details. As you'll see, with that increase, it actually saves, I believe, 7 additional positions. So of the 20, 7 come from the increase in class size. I'll be prepared to talk broadly about the class size issues, just from an educational perspective, but also I just want to be clear that that doesn't mean that all of our classes are going to be 25, right? Even with the increased number of sections, we don't achieve maximum efficiency in our staffing. And so across the board, our first grade, I believe, is averaging 22 students, and with the implementation of the higher cap, 22 students, and third grade is achieving, I believe, 23 students. So we'll share all of that detail at the Finance Committee meeting. So even though it sounds like 25, there will be classrooms that have 25, but on average, we will still be significantly below that threshold.
But we also know that we go over those caps as well, especially in our schools where we have really transient populations. For instance, when my daughter was in second grade with a 22 student cap, she had 26 students in her class. I think at one point in the year, 27 students.
Yeah, and I know that happened before I was superintendent, and we have consistently, when we get to those numbers, added another teacher to bring that down, unless there's no room in the school, and then we figure out other alternative ways of doing that. So it's either by doing a split or doing something along those lines, or adding ed tech services. So while that does happen, that is, absolutely not our practice in the last 4 years. I will point out that in the budget baseline, there are 2 additional positions that we would need to add if we don't move forward with the reconfiguration, just by the natural growth in some schools at certain grades. So those are built into the baseline, and so that reduction of 20 includes not adding those 2 positions.
Thank you. I have one more question for now. In the LAO plan investments, can you talk about how you chose the investments that you did include in the collaboration and specialized instruction at elementary schools and high schools over the other investments? Just how you weighed those?
Yeah. So it has the broadest impact of any of those options, and it also is the one that requires, just straightforward, requires additional staffing in order to be able to do that. We, as I mentioned in my presentation, will look for other ways to advance things, so potentially doing SLIFE with existing resources, students with limited and interrupted formal education with existing high school or secondary EL resources, using those to be able to do that. We would look to bring forward our heritage language programming in future years, or, try to find other ways to be able to do that with community resources. So that's the reason that we selected that one, is because that has the broadest reach in terms of being able to, position us to be able to provide quality instruction for all of our EL students in day-to-day in our K-12 settings.
Ms. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question about the expenditure budget. When you talked about the 8% increase in benefits, I know that several years we've worked with the MEA on working with them on negotiating insurances, et cetera. Is that on the table, or do you know if there's any discussion around that? Because if it's affecting us, I'm sure it's going statewide. I'm just wondering if there's been discussions with the MEA, or?
There have not been discussions. We expect in early April to get our estimates from them. I think we feel confident that what we've built in will fit with what we will get. But that's always, as you recall, a little bit of a surprise that we get our rates sometime in early April when we're already in the middle of the budget season. But we've not had any discussions about, hey, can you make that lower? So, because we don't know what it is. It could come in at 3%, in which case would be great.
So in the cost reduction options, programmatic reductions, you have listed here school models. So under staffing, you have IB coordinator, PHS freshman academy, organizational membership costs borne by the district. Do we not need to have the International Baccalaureate coordinator as part of that model, being an IB school? Is that not part of the requirement?
That's something that we're going to need to figure out if we move forward with reconfiguration. So again, that is not one of our proposals. Those were, what you're referring to are the list of all of the different reduction options that were considered and reviewed by the Finance Committee over the course of the fall.
Okay.
So that is not a proposed reduction.
Okay. So these are just things you looked at, these particular ones?
That's correct.
Okay.
It's a recall slide because that's
Yep.
stuff that we've done over the course of the fall to look at different options.
Okay. And then under resource reductions, I'd like to have some more detail around the central office operations. I know you have custodian, but then what is contracts, contingencies, and COLAs? And did you say that the full reduction in board contingency?
25? Yeah, 25 for both my contractual budget and your contingency. So that lowers it from 115 to 90, is that correct? Yeah.
Okay. And then what exactly does it mean, more specifics around the central office operations for the 207?
So again, we will absolutely have those details on it, but it's 25 and 25,
Right.
An adjustment in the COLA expectations for central office, the non-represented employees, and the custodian position that is proposed to be eliminated, and transportation contracts.
Okay.
And we can provide you with all of the detail
Okay.
at the finance.
And the supplies budget, I know that this is always on the chopping block, and it means, more and more supplies, obviously, for the classrooms, et cetera. Is that what you're referring to for supplies in that line, that the allocation that each school is given by per pupil type?
It's that, but it's also the department supplies, it's supplies in transportation, supplies in food service, supplies in general operations, academics, and so on. So what we did is we just asked everybody to make an across-the-board, a small cut of 3%, assuming that can, if the increase that's projected in their supplies is something that they can't cut, that they would find that elsewhere in their budget to be able to offset that reduction. But as an across-the-board way to get us to a place where we could bring you a budget that was balanced, that was one of the things that we put in there.
Okay, because I have concerns around that, and I know that we've tried that many, many times over the years, and the ones that bear the cost of our reduction there are the teachers, a lot of times because they're going to still buy things for their classrooms. And I see that that's going to be an expense that they will pick up because that's who they are. So I get concerned about when we start cutting supply budgets. And then the high school athletics co-curricular, we've already reduced, as I gave you part of my historical information. What do you propose, or what has been proposed for another $40,000?
We've asked, and Assistant Superintendent Townsend is working with the principals and the athletic directors to identify what that could be. So it could be everything from consolidation of teams and being able to reduce the number of stipends associated with those consolidations, or as well as just straightforward not filling some sports and so on. But we don't have the specifics at this point. I've just asked them to reduce by 2% the athletic and co-curricular budget.
Okay. I just want us to be really careful, too, about when we had that presentation, when they were discussing about turning things into clubs and the reductions more of sports going away, and then also the balance of Title IX, keeping that balance. But I would like to see before it's decided as to what exactly that would mean. And then, it's been a while since I've had a fourth or fifth grader, so remind me, I thought we had French and Spanish on fourth and fifth?
We don't.
So we're just down to Spanish, and then that one's going too?
I don't know when you had French, not in the last 4 years, so.
Okay, yeah, I was looking at Marty. I said, what happened to French? Okay. I think that's all I have right now. The reconfiguration, I'm confused that it's back here, because I thought, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought there was discussion around the fact that we were getting more money, therefore we weren't going to be proposing reconfiguration. So what am I misunderstanding about that?
I don't know who said that, so.
Okay. Because I thought we got an increase somewhere.
We did.
Okay. And so I thought at that time that it was less likely that we were going to have to do the reconfiguration as a result of that.
Again,
No?
these, I understand your question, and, I think my presentation attempted to show you how, for us to be able to advance some of our equity initiatives, we need to find the money somewhere, and that is the place where I'm proposing that we find the money.
Okay. And then can you, at some point, outline for us too the bigger picture of the reconfiguration, showing, like you said, that we would lose this amount of money if we did this, and we would have increased costs in transportation if we did this. So it seems a lot of ins and outs with the reconfiguration. So I know that
We're prepared to do an in-depth look at that, including all the questions that Member Figdor asked about, what's the maximum travel time, what's the, how many miles and so on, as part of our discussion with the Finance Committee on Thursday.
Okay. And I guess, as also, I'm just curious, as you were going through the budget, and you said you talked with your team about the preparing of the budget, which I'm thankful very much for the time you put into this, but I'm just wondering, did we have conversations as well with our union leadership to find out ideas that they may have outside of this for reductions? Because I know we've always gone to the various unions and said, what ideas do you have that you might be willing to bring forward? So I'm wondering what conversations we've had with the union leadership and
We
their
did not
members.
specifically go and say, what ideas would you like to propose? We have, over the course of the fall, in all of our Finance Committee meetings, discussed with the board and with, all of our constituents, are there other options? So that list that you saw is everything that has been put on the table for reductions. And so, if you have others, we'd be more than happy to look at them, but, we've asked for that numerous times.
I was just wondering if it incorporated, because I know that we were getting from the PEA leadership, they had done a survey, and some people had listed out various options, and so those were all taken into
So they're,
consideration.
mostly things like, closing a high school, things along those lines, many of which are already on that list. Moving central office, those are things that, are, very commonly raised. I've seen the survey that PEA did around the reconfiguration, and those have been, they're in that list.
Okay, and I had one last one. So if, you said with, so the central office relocation is part of this?
Central office relocation is not a part of
not
this.
part of it.
Again, I have
Okay.
a detailed explanation for that we're prepared to do with the Finance Committee on Thursday.
Okay, all right. And if we're not at the Finance Committee, we'll obviously get the information as well? Okay.
Of course.
All right, I guess that's all for the moment. Thank you.
Let's go, Ms. Bond. Did you have a question, Mr. Berg? Let's go. He gave me the eye. Let's go, Mr. Berg, and then Ms. Bondo.
Thank you. First of all, just to raise, if it hasn't, it seems that the audio quality on the live feed is not good for people online, so if we might be able to look into that. So I want to say thank you, too, to the superintendent and for your staff for doing the hard work at hand here and the diligent work you've done, and I think the effort you've put forth to help this budget process go smoothly. I appreciate all the thought and care you put into that. One question I have is at a higher level, just if I've gotten a lot of questions about why don't we have a 5-year budget plan, understanding that, things wouldn't go smoothly and we'd have to make adjustments, but at least we'd have things we'd benchmark progress against and understand where we're going in a bigger scope. Could you just say anything about that?
Well, I tried to reference that in my introduction. I do feel that we are getting ourselves to a place where we actually have the systems in place to be able to say these are the things that we'll be able to do. So if you look at all of the things that were on that list, that are the ones that are in the budget as well as the things that aren't in the budget, the things that aren't in the budget are the things that we will need to do in the coming years. Traditionally, the district has done that with the CIP. So if you look at our CIP, you'll see that, there's, for next year, $12 million worth of investments that need to be made. We're not going to have $12 million, so what we do is we roll those into the following year, and then the following year we have $14 million or something along those lines. And so that's the one place where it's happened, and I think that that's illustrative of why it's hard to do this, because, from year to year, we don't know how much money we're going to have. We don't know how much money we're going to be able to raise through tax increases, and so to sort of have this all mapped out is difficult. Last year, with our pre-kindergarten, we did that, and so you saw that in the baseline budget that we put forward, the 2 additional classrooms that were agreed to by the board last year, those were built into our multi-year budget and, were put into our baseline right when we started. We'll look to do the same thing with investments in special education, with investments in English language learner services and so on going forward. So I think that is, absolutely the right thing to do, and we need to get ourselves into a position where we have the methodology to do that. So the work that Assistant Superintendent Townsend has been doing to try to build a predictable model for our high school staffing will make a significant difference going forward, and that we'll be able to say, this is what we expect that we're going to need based on our upcoming enrollment and the types of courses that that we're offering. So it's a great question. It's something that has been slow to come, but I've heard that from board members, and I very much appreciate the feedback that I've gotten from several of you around trying to have sort of a more strategic approach, that it's not like we're trying to do everything in this one year. We've got right here on the table about $4 million worth of things that we want to do, and we have a $500,000 gap that we need to fill. So how do we do something to move that work forward? That's what this budget is.
Understood. And understanding there's no medium white T-shirts to be had here, and I understand if you say, well, I'll talk about it at the Finance Committee. Is there anything that you could say about why the decision is to go after school reconfiguration, which affects about 50% of our total student body, versus athletics, which affects about 20% of our student body, K through 12, and it has the numbers there,
Yeah, so I again tried to do that during my presentation. I believe that there are few options on that list that are both significant in terms of the amount of money that they can save, and that I feel that I can justify educationally, and reconfiguration, for all the reasons that I outlined, is one of those where I feel educationally I can defend that reduction. I don't feel I could defend a reduction that says, let's cut sports in half, or, 60%, or whatever the equivalent of the potential savings for reconfiguration associated with that. Same thing with language, with Spanish at the elementary level. Not ideal, not something that, that if we weren't in the situation of trying to move our work forward in other areas, we would want to consider. But given where we are, that's why, the no white T-shirts medium.
Okay. One last one, and again, can expect this will be deferred to another conversation, but what needs to be done to the buildings in order to prep them for this change of who they're designed for and who would be occupying them, converting them to a K through 12 or a 3 through 5?
Not a huge amount. There is no school that we have that does not currently have kindergartners, or does not currently have fifth graders. So we don't have to completely change the configuration of our buildings to be able to accommodate whatever population happens to be there, whether it's the pre-K 2 or whether it's the 3 through 5. There will be a lot of furniture that needs to be moved and things along those lines. And, I'm not in any way, shape, or form discounting the logistical challenge that will be for us to be able to do everything that needs to happen in that time frame. So I don't mean to, gloss over and say like it's fine, we just pack a box and move it over. It's absolutely, there's a ton of staff work that needs to happen, there's a ton of culture work that needs to happen, and there's a ton of logistical work that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I'll save my comment for another time. Thank you, Superintendent.
Yeah.
Let's go Ms. Bondo and then Ms. Habib-Sai.
Thank you, Superintendent. I have a quick question. I just read on your narrative here that you've been saying about the world language, then they will study in the older age. And I know that to learn a better English is when you start a little younger, because on your older age it's so hard to go over. So we have the world language, if understood, just the Spanish right now in the elementary area. So are we already think about the deduction on other language? I mean, little more like a middle school, high school. Do we see any cost on those area? Because I see better those world language. We want to try to find some deduction. Are we thinking over there on those side, or just see then that's the best way to go with the world language from the elementary school? Then don't see any picture from the other side of the other school, like a district on the middle school and high school as well.
So no, we're not proposing to reduce any of the world language programming at the middle school or at the high school. This is again, a deliberate choice to say that, if we need to find a place where we can make reductions that will allow us to be able to do some of the things that we want to do, this is a nice to have, that it does, without a doubt, have the potential to impact the number of kids that will be able to get to a seal of biliteracy. There are a handful of students that, because they start earlier, they're more likely to sort of follow it up into middle school and subsequently to high school. So I'm not saying that there is no negative effect of eliminating elementary Spanish, but that's the choice that we've presented you.
Okay, so I have a follow-up question maybe later on. On the high school, on the resource reduction here, on the high school staffing, when we base to the enrollment based, it's just because of the high school, because when I look at some enrollment, it's going to be some of the enrollment based, and we have some reductions on some of the middle school as well. So are we thinking just on the 3 teachers on the high school based on the decrease on the enrollment? Are we thinking also to to the middle school as well?
We're not proposing any cuts
Anything
to
on
the middle school.
Okay. For the reconfiguration, I was kind of a little tricky about the reconfiguration here by C. Then I know then most of my colleagues ask about the transportation. This is one of the issues. I'm really concerned about all the cost of all the transition is going to affect the area, because that's something that we're really thinking about doing that one on once. I mean, quick fix right now. That's the idea. So are we already evaluate the cost on all the transition, because we need to add up with this so we have a better sense what the saving will come out. Because if we're adding more expenses, then we need to, on the top of everything, then we have to build for the transition. Transportation bursts everything with the teachers readjustment and the student and all the community is a cost associated with that.
There is no cost associated with the transportation and reconfiguration as long as we do the pre-K transportation proposal that we also have in the budget. So basically, that pre-K transportation proposal covers the additional staffing that's needed for us to be able to do the elementary reconfiguration.
The selection on the teacher, because I see almost the teacher, then we try to do on the reconfiguration. Are we going to select those teachers as the selection will be done?
Yeah, there's a contractual process to follow, and our staff will work closely with the principals and with the Teachers Association to make those decisions based on what's in the contract.
Okay. I'm good for now.
Ms. Habib Sai?
Thank you. I just had a couple of clarifying questions for myself going through this packet, I guess, and you touched base a little bit on this one, but with the high school staffing, with the resource reductions, when you talked about how we would have 2 teachers at Deering and 1 teacher at Portland leave because of the incoming freshman class being smaller, this is subject to change in the upcoming years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that,
my question.
yeah,
So
that's
this is subject to change. It's not going to be the same with what we're expecting in the future as well, right?
Right, but that is based on what we're expecting for Deering next year and what we're expecting for Portland next year. As I mentioned, though, Assistant Superintendent Townsend is working on a formula-based staffing model that will change every year depending on what the enrollment is. So, if the enrollment is higher, then the staffing goes up. If the enrollment is lower, the staffing goes down.
Okay. And then I had a question on the FY21 investments, I guess, because it was a little bit surprising to me, the cost, but the website and how it's $50,000, is that because it's under contract service, it's that much?
That's right. That's the cost to enter into a contract with a new provider and to transition. That's going to be a year-long project to be able to transition from our current website to a new and better website.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we'll go back to Ms. Thompson.
I just had a question for you. You said, or actually Miranda said, the proposed budget was $122.3 million. That was a 4.2% over FY20 and a 3% in the school tax rate. If we were not to increase property taxes at all, what does that mean? It means no investments. I know, I get that. But from the status quo, how much from the status quo would we have to reduce if there was no tax increase whatsoever?
About $3 million in addition to the $500,000 that's currently.
So $3 million from the status quo to maintain?
So the budget would be about $119 million.
Right, so that would be no investments and then 3 million reduction from the status quo?
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted clarification on that. And then configuration comparisons, did we have?
I'm sorry, I want to clarify.
Sure.
So the investments we proposed were $1.4 million. So that would be part of the, we proposed a 3% tax rate. So we have to reduce the $122.3 million by $3 million to have no tax rate increase. 1.4 million of that would be achieved by not doing investments, and then we'd have to reduce it another 1.4 1.5 or 1.6 million or so, for a total reduction of 3 million from what we've proposed.
Total, okay.
Yep.
Okay. Can we just, I have questions that are coming across from people about that, so can we just spell that out somewhere? Okay. And then the configuration comparisons, refresh my memory, did we look at other models from other districts? And I can't recall that at all. Can you tell me?
Well, we had two different options, so different pairings of schools.
Right.
And this is the one that we landed that meets multiple criteria. So we'll talk about that in depth with the Finance Committee on Thursday. But in essence, it allows us to have our it allows us, we can do transportation, so that was a big one. So, one of the variables was the Reiki East End pairing, and that was a requirement from our transportation department in order to be able to do the necessary transportation we needed to be able to keep the peninsula schools together. So that was one. It also allows us to have the appropriate district-level special education programs. So, Breathe, Bridge, Beach are all configured successfully in this particular model. When we did the elementary reconfiguration presentation back in January, we shared examples of surrounding districts and how they're configured, and so we'll do that again on Thursday, and you'll see that this is, a common configuration in, several of the districts around us.
Okay. I guess the Thursday is the meeting to be had, everybody to be at, but some of us can't make that. So for the community as well as people that cannot be there, sounds like a lot of discussion is going to happen, and all handouts will be available, everything that's discussed, et
As they
cetera.
always are, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
And we've been Facebook Living our meetings, even the committee ones, so that at least we'll have that too. Do you mind, Mr. Balfin, since he hasn't gone, so we'll go Mr. Balfin and then Ms. Victor.
Thank you. If we don't go with elementary reconfiguration this year, and knowing the financial, stresses that we'll be facing in the future, can we expect to see elementary reconfiguration in future proposed budgets?
I can't answer that question. I mean, at some point, if our projections for next year are true, so we're looking at a $2 million drop in our EPS funding, if that were to come true, and if the council set a tax increase target that was similar to this year's, we would need to look at other options for reducing our budget. And so it is likely that that will continue to be a need in the future, as will be other potential reductions along the way. So I don't think that it, I'm not guaranteeing that it will be, but because if we said that we could raise, we got more state funding and we could raise tax revenues by a larger amount, we could potentially not have to cut anything.
Thank you.
Well, back to Ms. Victor.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we've ever had the city council set our budget number at the outset of our process before we've determined our needs, the needs of our students and the schools?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Has it occurred during the time that you've been superintendent?
The council has set guidelines, and we've then, come in with a different budget.
But not at the outset of our process?
They did a couple years ago. Yeah.
But our budget wasn't hemmed in by their budget guidance early on?
My first year here, it was.
Okay, thank you. It looks to me like in the reconfiguration proposal that you've included today, that pre-K classrooms are in the primary schools. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then I believe that summer school is getting scaled back as a result of a loss of federal funds. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so this proposal does not, would we be able to sustain the program we've been running, let alone expand it as we know we need to do in order to better serve our disadvantaged students?
No.
So we would be cutting back our summer school.
Yes?
Can you talk about what that might look like?
I'll let,
I mean, we don't have the plans in terms of what we would exactly do, but I think when you recall of the superintendent's three big priorities, the third one was reducing barriers to access, and within that was Lao Plan, special ed, and summer, and retaining, addressing the gaps. So that wasn't one of the things in his incremental, proposal. But, we are starting to have conversations about grant funding, not federal grant, but can we find other foundations that might help invest? So I think there's still a commitment to creative thinking to do what we can to retain and expand, because we believe strongly it's necessary. But we don't yet have specific plans of how we're going to prioritize. And we do have some foundations that we have in mind that we're going to try to pursue conversations with.
Thank you. And then for pre-K, I know the ELL slots are not filled, or not included in the proposal in the budget before us. And you mentioned something about addressing our EL students' needs in a different way for now. Can you talk about what what you're referring to?
no, I can't right now, because I do think that there are more, there are ideas and ways that we might be able to do that differently, as well as potentially phasing in some of those resources over time.
And then I'm wondering if we're not able to provide before and after care for pre-K this coming year, given that it was a major barrier that we identified in the research, are we confident that enough families are going to be able to participate without before and after care in order to fill 2 additional classrooms?
I mean, I can't say yes, we're absolutely confident. So far, I think, I think that the barrier of transportation would be significant in creating more access. I would not be able to predict how much of the barriers, how much that will help for families that are not applying to the lottery right now because of the lack of transportation and before and after care. So I think we address part of it, but not all of it, and I can't predict what impact that would have.
And then I believe in some districts in Maine, the transportation is provided to alternate after-school programs. Would, so that the school district isn't providing the after-school care, but an alternative, a community provider is. Would that be an option to take some of our pre-K kids to an alternative aftercare site? Or
We absolutely would entertain that, as well as allowing providers that have their own vehicles to pick up kids and things along those lines, which we do already. So, again, I can't commit to it because it depends on where that provider is, how many students, at what time, all of those different things factor into. We don't have anywhere near unlimited capacity in our transportation department.
Okay, 2 more questions about athletics, and then I will give others an opportunity. The 2% cut in athletics, I'm wondering, with that cut, are we still increasing the money we're spending on athletics faster than the overall budget?
I don't believe that we are, because I think the increase was roughly in the 1% range, so it probably, actually, that's because we're not touching, you probably know the answer.
I wish I could say I knew the answer. I don't definitively know the answer, but I don't see any reason why we would be.
Maybe my question isn't clear. Mm-hmm. So when we looked at the presentation on transportation at our last meeting, we saw that we're spending more. The increase in spending on athletics is greater than the increase in our budget, and so I'm wondering, with this 2% cut, does it come in line with the increase in our budget, Or are we still spending more on athletics than we are on academics in terms of the increase?
I think I'd have
We
to.
could get to the answer.
Okay. And then my last question, I know there's still a lot of outstanding information that we've requested on athletics. I'm wondering, and I unfortunately was in California for work during that meeting, and so wasn't able to ask my own questions, but I am wondering if you're going to provide equity data with respect to athletics, so we can look at the demographics of who is participating and make sure that when we consider the money we're spending on athletics, that we're doing so with an equity lens, the lens that we're using to make our overall investments in our budget and to prioritize.
I know that's one of the data requests, so we are working on that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Atkinson, and then I'll go through a couple I have.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Superintendent and staff, for all the work that went into this. My first question is on the tax rate computation slide. I just wanted to understand if the increase in valuation has been verified by city staff, the $85 million, 1.1% increase?
It's what I received from the city staff, but it's not official from the assessor yet.
Okay. I know that that's probably going to be confused with the revaluation this year, and yeah. The other question I had on that, do you know how that compares to last year's change?
Exactly the same at this point.
Okay, great, thank you. Excuse me, I gotta flip through here. One more. Nope, three more. The website, when was that last updated, last refreshed, first
I think
created?
about 4 years ago, it was right, I just remember it was my first meeting here, or second meeting here, was when it was refreshed.
Digging into the extremely meaningful work from day one, I guess, there. Communications are important, that's true. But I can't imagine that was your thing you were most excited to dig into on your first day.
I thought it was a good website at the time. I think it's
Yeah.
just not
You were
panned
the
out
only
the way
one.
that we thought it would, so.
The reduction in the custodian, I'm a little concerned about that, just given the what I think of as the sort of physical debt that we're in as a district with respect to our buildings. Can I expect that is going to sort of further exacerbate that situation?
I mean, I don't think that a couple of things. There are 6 vacant custodian positions. We have a tough time filling those positions right now. So this is eliminating one of those positions, but it's also reconfiguring several of the other vacant positions to be able to increase our capacity by turning some of those into maintenance positions, which will be able to do other things than what our custodians do. So they will all continue to be. The only reduction is in the elimination of one of those positions, but there's a significant plan behind this from our facility staff that they believe that this actually helps us to move forward in a way that, having 6 vacant positions doesn't.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. That one's asked and answered. I think I'm all set. Thank you.
Mr. Varro?
I just had a couple questions, and I don't necessarily need answers to them tonight, but if we could prepare them for the Finance Committee. The first was the state EPS subsidy is up to $745,386, and I'm just wondering if we could get an explanation. I think it was last that it was $650. Okay.
So we got $100,000 more over the course of this year than we expected, and we didn't budget that because it was an emergency, it was a bus reimbursement, and so it's the difference between so the 660 or so that you're referring to is the difference between our FY21 EPS versus our actual FY20 expected, and what you're seeing in the budget book is our expected FY21 EPS versus our budgeted.
Okay, got it. And then I was wondering if we could, because we have a bunch of staff positions sort of moving, being added in some areas and subtracted in another, if we could get just some net staffing levels at different levels, teachers, different categories of staffing. And then my last question, and I think you're probably already going to address this because you said you'll have an in-detail presentation on the reconfiguration, is just an explanation of how we went from the expected cost savings of roughly 650 to 750 to now around $1 million.
And we will discuss that in detail. I think, one big piece of that is the addition of the class size change that we propose. So that's 7 of those FTE right there. So that's a big one. And then, we said when we talked about it then that we would be truing up our costs, and what we've seen is some ups and some downs as we've actually, looked at the numbers of students and where they would go and what that would allow us to do in terms of the number of sections, which is the primary driver of the changes in funding.
I have one quick question clarifying, and it's for Miranda. The 13.5% increase on the utilities, I know you explained it, but I got lost in it. Can you clarify that for me?
Sure. So we're proposing an increase in utilities that's 13% over the FY20 budget, but it's actually only 3% more than what we spent in FY19. So we're expecting to come in a little over budget this year, and really what we're doing is truing up kind of those costs and making sure we're not short next year. Does that answer your question? It's electricity and natural gas primarily.
Okay. And the only other thing that I had was just asking to ask for some information ahead of Thursday. I'd just like to see for the world languages classes the curriculum, or really what what's included in that instruction, so we have a better idea of it. Yeah, I think you understand what I mean by that. Do we have any other questions? Oh, geez. Let me go Ms. Morioni, and then back to Ms. Bondo.
I think this may be back with Miranda a bit too, but this was, I pulled up the presentation you provided at the forum. And just going back to that slide that you showed us around, where'd it go now? Shoot. It's coming. When we got the state numbers back, and we found out that our mill rate was 8.18. And so we had that change, negative 1% change. That slide that you gave there, and you said FY 2020 versus FY 2021, and then the change was 658.9. That slide. So what I understood by that slide was if we stayed status quo, we would only be, missing 658.9. But that's not what you were just saying before. It's like, actually, that was, Ms. Thompson and I were just very confused by the idea, because before we thought that if nothing changed, if no new investments were made, we would only be seeing this amount of reduction based on the additional, the change in the state funding. So I guess that's the part that would be helpful to, it's confusing. It'd be about helpful to understand a little bit more.
And we'll work with you to help you to understand it, so we can sit down and, and walk through that in more detail,
So was that, we misunderstood that?
I think
Do you know what I'm
that's-
talking about, Miranda, that slide?
I'm not
that you-
100% sure if I'm understanding you, but so back when I did the presentation at the forum, we were expecting a budget gap of, I think, $450,000 or so.
Right.
That was already in light of the fact that we were getting 660,000 more in state subsidy. We still were facing a $450,000 budget gap just versus our kind of baseline status quo projections.
Okay.
In terms of the figure, the specific figure in terms of our increase in EPS, it's kind of what I tried to explain in response to Ms. Trevorrow's question. The increase in state subsidy is 660,000 over our expected actuals this year from the state, and 750,000 or so, I can't remember the figure exactly, versus our budget from last year. I'm not sure if that is addressing your question, if you want to.
No, again, I think it was just confusing by thinking that it can, because the additional state revenue or funding, that we would be, the additional amount that we're talking about is really on top of what we currently, if we maintain status quo, this additional money needed, basically for the,
And maybe, I don't know if this is going to help. I tend to not help when I try to do these explanations. So I'm trying to, so if we had not gotten the additional $650,000 from the state, our gap walking in with, if we wanted to meet the 3% tax increase guideline, would have been closer to $1 million than it would be to $450,000, because that would have been, that would have been revenue that we didn't have, that we would need to, if we were going to meet that 3% tax increase, we would have had to cut $1 million off the bat.
okay, I think I understand it better.
That actually helped.
It did help. Yeah, again, that earlier in the
Can we
forum,
cut
the
it
other
off now
slide
and
was just
just,
confusing to me looking, but thank you.
Ms. Bondo?
Just a few clarification. I tried to look at here on the reconfiguration here. The way we just put on my district, I see Rocky and East End, and I see Rocky over there and East End on this side. And I tried to look at on the, are we thinking about the starting time of from the school, because we have to change. We have this side of school, they're going to have just the pre-K to 2 and the 3 to 5 on the other side. So as the transportation will be happening, we thinking about changing the starting time, or they all going to start the same time?
Well, we'll get into that. So I don't remember the specifics of that particular configuration, but we will have those schools starting, I don't remember if they're starting at the same time or they're starting at different times.
And also, I know each school has its own particularity, having a partnership. So I try to figure out, by putting Rocky and East End already, do we have a sense of partnership between school and student? Because are we going to move, student will move and the teacher also be moved on some of those schools? So other partnership can break down. Do we already see the picture we look like to have those transition done?
No, we have not. Again, that is part of what we will need to do. There's a methodology for doing it that is built into the contract for making those decisions. And, seniority, things along those lines plays an important part of that. Okay. I mentioned in response to Member Burke's question that there is a significant amount of work that needs to happen still around staffing. There's a significant amount of work that needs to happen around culture, which is, I think, what you're referring to. Right. So, established relationships that people have that, potentially will change as a result of this. So I do think that, I'm not discounting the amount of work that needs to happen in that, but that can't happen until we're actually in the work of making that transition.
If I recall, then I know that any methodology and any cultural change is a value, is a cost associated with that. So I think when we look at on the reconfiguration to be really a saving, and then you're still working on that, I think for me, I will have a better sense if we get everything coming together with the transportation, the methodology, the culture associated value. Then we can see, are we really saving it, or are we adding some more expenditure on the top of that?
And I'm fairly confident on the expenditure side of that, but I don't have a price tag for building the culture, nor do I think that that's something that happens in in 1 year. I mean, I think those schools will build their cultures over time, and so I don't have a price tag associated with that, but I do have a clear sense of what the savings are, which also include those costs that are associated with that. So transportation is not a cost, but the loss in food service revenue is a cost. So those things are accounted for.
Okay, I'm going to keep continuing some debate on that. It's a lot to be said, so I don't want to to ask a question. I'm good for now.
Mr. Atkinson, and then I got one last one.
It's going to be quick, and I think maybe Mr. Varro actually already asked for this. I'm just trying to wrap my head around all the changes that are being proposed at each of the schools. So, yeah, just looking at what are the staffing changes at each of the schools, associated with the reconfiguration, associated with Breathe being redistributed across, it's just hard to tease apart on this page here. Yep. Thank you.
So I guess my question is, seeing that we hear a lot from members of the community and elsewhere that concerns about reconfiguration, under the scenario that the school board does not feel comfortable with making that change, I'd like to see at the finance committee then what that leaves us to make investments. So which of these ELL teacher positions, special ed coordinator, how would you then prioritize? So just so to kind of be ready to do a quote unquote plan B.
Yep. Will do.
Anything else?
So just very quickly then, I just want to leave you with the timeline for the budget. Again, we have a meeting on Thursday to look at the budget, and that's actually not in here. So that's great. So there is a meeting on the 12th, and that is a finance committee meeting. It's already advertised and scheduled. Then there is another finance committee meeting, which is also at this point scheduled as a public hearing, and that will be next Monday. So for members of the public who would like to weigh in, that is foreseen to happen at the meeting on the 16th. Then we obviously have a significant time lag between March 16th and March 31st, where it would come as a first read to the board, and there would also be a public hearing. I think the idea was that we would have time within that time frame to have additional finance committee meetings and discussions along the way. So that's part of the plan in having that March 16th to March 31st lag. And then right now, this is scheduled for a board vote on April 7th. So, and then it goes into the city council and the city council process.
Yeah. Can I just add to that on the package on today's agenda, the location for those meetings is highlighted here, which is the central office.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a note on that. The public hearing, Finance Committee meeting on March 16th will be at Casco Bay right here. I believe the printed copy says that it's going to be at central office, but the web copy I updated, I think. But yeah, it's planned to be at Casco Bay.
And when we notice those meetings, obviously that information will be accurate. All right, so we're gonna move on. Where's my cheat sheet?
I have one more comment.
Oh, we got one more, Mr. Burke.
It's mostly a comment for the record.
We do have, just to, as a reminder, we do have a board discussion section as part of our, so yeah, if you want to leave it for there. I hate when I do that. I interrupt. My dude, yeah, my bad. If it's more appropriate to do it during the board discussion, it might lend itself then. So next, we finished with our questions on the motion. Is there any public comment on the motion? And I'll remind anyone that wants to address the board that the motion on the floor is to accept and recommend, or rather refer the budget to the Finance Committee. So we'll try to limit the comments to that particular action. So if anyone would like to address the board, you can please come up to the podium, and I'll go over the public comment rules. It's a bit disappointing, Steve. but that's fine.
Could you maybe explain
Right,
what
so
you
is
mean
it a
by
procedural vote?
what
Because
you're
you're already
voting on?
meeting on
Right.
Thursday, so if you're already meeting, you don't want any comment really on the actual plan? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So in the past, the way that we've addressed public comment when this motion comes up, we've tried to avoid the public comment be directed at the actual content of the budget, because that's not necessarily the motion. I would add that that's a difficult distinction to make sometimes. So I will welcome anyone that's willing to come up and speak, acknowledging that if the comments become directed in a certain direction, I more than likely will interrupt and ask for it to be clarified. But again, it's a difficult distinction to make. It's what we've done in the past.
When we've referred the budget, we've asked, have community ask questions?
So that's what I mean. So the motion is to refer to the budget. So the comments usually refer to that motion, not necessarily asking questions on the budget, on the content of the budget. Yeah, and I'm not necessarily good at explaining that. So if you don't mind, you'll have 3 minutes to address the board. When we get close to the 3 minutes, I'll try to politely interrupt you, and if you need additional time, we'll grant it accordingly. And if you don't mind starting with your name and your address, please.
My name is Emily Chaliff. I live at 81 Brighton Avenue in Member Berks District. I am a member of the board of the Foundation for Portland Public Schools. I do not stand here as a representative of that board, but merely to indicate my support for the public schools of this city, and the reason why I live in this city is for these public schools. I still don't know that I'm totally clear on what I'm supposed to be commenting on, but you all have a letter from me that you received at the end of January after the first presentation. There has been significant changes between the two presentations. At that point, it was about budget, and now it's about equity. The equity case has not been made, and there's significant work, as Superintendent Botana has noted, in the planning of this, and the timing does not allow for that. And culture can happen in the process, and there is no process here. It is being rammed down our throats, and our kids will suffer, and our teachers will suffer. And so in that sense, I do not recommend a motion to the Finance Committee. I think there is more work to be done, and that this budget is not ready. I guess that is my point.
Yeah. And so I'm going to clarify why the distinction is necessary to be made. You're absolutely right. This budget is not prepared. This is not a final budget. What we're doing now is literally kicking off the process of developing a budget. And I don't intend to have a back and forward, and this is why the distinction is difficult to make. We do have public hearings, as the superintendent mentioned, in the Finance Committee. And that would probably be at the point in which decisions will start to be made on behalf of the board. And I think that that's when it's more than likely important, not more than likely, that's definitely when it's going to be most important that we hear the comments. Because what we've heard right now is the superintendent's proposal. What the comments are going to be directed to is what the board, who are the elected officials, how we respond to what he's proposed. So at that time is when public comment is probably going to be most necessary and most helpful to us. So having said that, if anyone else would like to address the board. Come up to the podium.
My name is Cyrus Shahan. I live at 19 Merrill Street. A budget proposal should not have so many holes in it and should not ignore the immaterial costs and the environmental costs that the budget can't account for. Yeah. Is that okay?
I'm not sure I totally understand whether I'll be interrupted. My name is Jessica Milneal. I live at 45 Smith Street. In terms of other options that were considered instead of reconfiguration, I'm wondering whether management of your parking lots was looked at. That was a significant expense for the PHA. It looks like it's a $600,000 expense for the budget. It was about $300,000 when the PHA looked at their parking lots. excuse me, at least at the East End School, that is an underused parking lot that could be turned into affordable housing. And I think that would increase the city's tax base, provide affordable workforce housing for employees, and eliminate the significant annual maintenance expenses associated with the asphalt. In terms of things that are nice to have, close parking is nice to have, but honestly, I can park a block away. Thank you.
Hi, John Thibodeau from Equity in Portland Schools, 114 Clinton Street. And I don't know if this is technically appropriate either, but I'll give it my best shot. I think most of the people in this room, most of the people in Portland want to seriously address equity, and we want that to happen. This proposal for reconfiguration, I feel, sidetracks, confuses, and conflates that issue. It makes it more difficult. It is an enormous undertaking. It's a massive overhaul, and it's not founded on a solid ground. There are just giant holes all over the place. It's not sound. And the expectation to pull this off over the summer,
So, John, I'm going to interrupt you.
Sure.
I'm going to restate the motion just so that we're
Sure.
clear, and I'll try once again. And if anyone else can help me make this distinction. So the motion is to accept the superintendent's FY21 budget and refer it to the Finance Committee. So on the merits of that is what the comments should be, and your comments so far are directed to the content
Sure.
of the budget.
Okay, I think I got it.
And what I value that, again, we have built-in opportunities for that to happen.
Gotcha. I don't know if this is possible, but if it's possible to refer this budget to the Finance Committee without reconfiguration, so that focus can be just on equity measures, and this can be clear, and it can be a sound process. I feel like that's possible. Reconfiguration is not in this time frame, and not in this type of process. So that would be my ask. I don't know if it's possible, but.
Thompson.
I just want to, I think what's confusing about this too is some people don't know from historical our process. So like on March 16th, the Finance Committee will be voting out the budget from the Finance Committee, and then coming to, that's not up there.
The March 30th is when the Finance Committee is going to vote the budget out.
Right, okay, so that date's not up there, so that's why I was asking about that too, I guess. So we're missing a few dates. So I didn't know for the public where there's all these comment periods built in, because the process in which this goes to the Finance Committee has, like you said, meetings, they have a public hearing, it gets voted out of there, there is public comment at that Finance Committee, comes to the board as the Finance's recommended budget, and then there's public comment amongst the board, and then we have our vote at another time. I just want to make sure people understand that because of the gaps here, and I guess we just need to update the budget timeline to match when things are getting voted out, because it is really confusing. I think the first person that spoke saying that they think the preparation is not ready, that's more in line with the motion, like you said. So just wanted to clarify, because sometimes it is very confusing.
Yeah, it is tricky.
Yeah.
It's a tricky
Thank you.
distinction.
May I try, Chair, as well?
No, please do it.
All right.
By all means.
So first of all, this is really intense, right? A lot of things at stake. So I just want to honor that we're all holding that level of emotion and care. And I think there is this nuance of this motion to say that maybe I'll upset my colleagues. There'll be the non-agenda comment opportunity as long as we're done with the formal agenda by 10 p.m., which is when there's no rules in terms of like, is it a motion or is it not a motion? You can say what you want, as well as what you're trying to be guided into of what's already been preset for when to speak specifically about the budget and trying to help you track how to develop it. As somebody that's new to the board, I know this is really overwhelming. It's really hard to find this information. It's really hard to make the time to be here tonight, so thank you all for being here. But I think what you did hear, the difference between what Mr. Thibodeau did and what was said prior about, like, could you do this in terms of how it is referred, is what is being asked for as comment right now. Next opportunity is public comment prior to 10 p.m. on any items not on this evening's agenda, and then all the other opportunities that have being reiterated at future meetings. That's my understanding.
Stephen Sheriff of Cumberland Avenue. I'm going to simplify it. This is a perfunctory motion that you get every year to accept the budget from the superintendent and then refer to the finance committee. In past years, when I've objected to it, it's because I felt the dollar amount was so significantly higher than what you could ever possibly do that I felt the superintendent needed to take it back to bring in a lower dollar amount or something like that. But it's a perfunctory motion, and it's a standard process in any, when the city council gets the city manager's budget, they accept it and refer it to committee. It's just perfunctory. And it really is, it's whether you should actually refer it to committee, which you did get some comments related to that, so.
Thank you, Stephen. I feel like Stephen fulfilled his duty today. If there's no one else that wants to address the board tonight, we'll close the public comment and we'll move to board discussion. Is there any further board discussion? Going once?
Further board discussion. Oh, my comment from earlier that I wanted to bring forth was that understanding our focus on equity and understanding that there is some thinking related to school reconfiguration and how it could address equity, which is largely about the demographic data as well as opening up the allocation of resources to do some of the funding we want to do. I think there's a separate body of work that I haven't heard addressed, which is about the culture in our buildings, particularly how we are welcoming and doing our anti-racism work in our buildings, so that no matter what the configuration is of our elementary schools, that Black and Indigenous and people of color feel welcomed, feel affirmed, that they can be there in their full sense of identities, and that doesn't matter if we're in K through 5 or pre-K through 3 and whatever that is. So that's a separate body of work that I'm interested in, period. And I think the reconfiguration obstructs the ability for us to do that work because we're doing too much too fast. And that culture building work is important, vital, and shouldn't be delayed or obstructed with the reconfiguration planning.
Ms. Figdo?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're here tonight with this budget in front of us because we have, over many years, had huge achievement and opportunity gaps in the city of Portland with students of color and economically disadvantaged students and English language learners performing 30 and 40 points lower than their white, economically advantaged peers. And to put this budget in context, we're proposing, or the superintendent's proposing, a huge upheaval in how we educate our youngest students because the city has nickeled and dimed the schools for so long that there just aren't other places to cut. And it's, as I see it, really, I mean, we can't continue to allow our students of color, our English language learners, our economically disadvantaged students to fall through the cracks. It's unethical for us as leaders of the school district to allow the students to fall through the cracks. However, we can't, for me, it's unacceptable to make the basic, to make the change that is included in this budget. So I look forward to, there's very strong evidence, academic research that shows the more you spend on public education, the better student outcomes are, not just academically, but throughout their lives. We, as a district, are, when you look at comparables to surrounding districts, to other districts in the similar districts in the state. We are below others in what we're spending, or at best, kind of in the middle of the pack, but in many respects, below comparable districts. We need to invest in public education if we're going to get the outcomes, and that means, yes, we need to center equity, but we don't want to, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and cause this massive upheaval in our in how we educate our elementary school students. So I look forward to moving forward with a budget that is able to meet all of our students' needs and isn't constrained by what the city council has told us up front, but we put together a budget that is within reason, given limited resources in the city, but is better meets the needs of all of our kids. And I appreciate all of the work that has gone into this. I appreciate the focus on equity, and we have to break through this logjam that we've had in letting disadvantaged kids, students of color, and English language learners fall through the cracks. It's not okay for us to do that. We have to be serious about the investments. It's hard to see the investments that we're not making because we know that so much more needs to be done in the areas that the superintendent has identified as priority areas. It's heartbreaking to see some of the investments we're not going to be able to make. I appreciate the hard decisions that the superintendent and his team have come to. I am not going to agree with all of them, but I look forward to the discussion over the next few weeks and months.
Mr. Varro?
Just a point of order, Chair, that the same rule applies to us as board members in our deliberation as applied to the public in making their comments, that comments should be strictly kept to the motion on the table, which is a motion to refer this to the Finance Committee. There's a process by which we take up the budget, and it goes to the Finance Committee, at which point it can be amended. Then it goes back to the board, at which point it can be amended. And, to preempt that process usurps the authority of the committee.
Ms. Marioni?
I would like to call for a vote by the board.
Excuse me. All those in favor of accepting the superintendent's FY21 budget and referring to the Finance Committee, please indicate. And that's unanimous with the students voting with the majority. Okay, moving on. Given that it's before the hour of 10 p.m., it's 9:03. Is there any public comment on items not on this evening's agenda?
So can we comment on the budget?
The budget's on the agenda, yeah. Seeing none, is there a motion to adjourn the business meeting? Ms. Morioni, second by Ms. Trevorrow. All those in favor, please indicate. And that's unanimous with the students voting with the majority. We've adjourned at 9:04 p.m.